The Mark Thompson Show.
Well, if you know me at all, you know I'm a massive fan of our next guest. I think he's without peer when it comes to bringing into the dialogue and discourse concepts about our country, about governance, and writing on progressive politics. And it's not just writing. He is the top progressive voice on his syndicated radio show. How about it for Thom Hartmann, everybody?
Thanks,
Look at you, Thom Hartmann.
Great to see you again.
Yeah. Albert, I thought I was supposed to have some like royal music to bring on Thom Hartmann. Was that Toe? Thank you. That's a little bit better. Yeah. Very good. All right, let's not, he's embarrassed by it. Stop it. All right, anyway. Hey, Thom, I love your new book, The Hidden History of America, of American Democracy, I should say, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. In fact, there's a lot in that title that is reflected right out of the gate in the book. I've read a bunch of your stuff. You know, I love the Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight that you did. This is no different. First of all, it told me a bunch of things that I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know. I think I accepted all of the ways in which our democracy and the birth of our nation is talked about and then changed in the various ways it's talked about through generations. Your essential premise here is that democracy, as bold an experiment as we're involved in, predated America by a bunch.
Yeah, like 300,000 years.
And native peoples, in essence, their societies were more reflective of democracies than even ours.
More often than not. Yeah, there were some native societies that were little dictatorships. There was an interesting piece just published last week in Nature magazine, in the peer-reviewed journal, Science Journal. There's some anthropologists and archaeologists down in Central America who found in Mesoamerica, in ancient Mesoamerica, you know, like 5, 10, 15,000 years ago, they found all these communities that there was no evidence of really rich people and no evidence of great poverty, no evidence of essentially a ruling class. These were communities from as small as a few thousand people to as many as several 100,000 people who were run democratically thousands of years ago. And what they determined was that those communities were actually more resilient than were their neighbors that were run by little dictators. They were less likely to fail in the face of drought or famine or even being attacked by others. The resilience level of democracies, small d democracies, is much, much higher, at least in that study.
It's interesting, too, because the other thing that I didn't realize is that those who crafted our Constitution were students of that, some of what you've talked about. That is to say, Jefferson's tie to native peoples, for example, you discuss in the book, and they were such students of political philosophy and of those native peoples to which you've referred, that it was interesting to learn that clearly was informing a lot of the way they were pursuing crafting our Constitution.
Yeah. It's really a pretty amazing story. Jefferson was enamored of the what were called the Whig histories, and I don't recall if this, typically when I write a book, about 20% of it gets cut out by the editors, and I don't recall if this made it through into the book or not. But there was a history of England by Paul de Rapin de Torras that was written in the late 1600s, and or the early 1700s. And Jefferson was a huge proponent of this book, and it was the story of the tribal people of the United Kingdom, the red-haired tribal people. Jefferson was a redhead. The red-haired tribal people who were conquered before the Roman conquest in like 150 BC or whenever it was. And they lived small d democratically. They had an egalitarian society. They had a council of elders that kind of made decisions. It was an amazing history. David Hume hated it There was a big debate about it in the 1700s about whether these Whig histories were accurate or just speculation. But he also, he traveled with his father when he was a young man. His father was a map maker in Virginia, traveled all over Virginia, got to know Native Americans. Half of Virginia at that time was Indian territory, and spoke several of their languages. His father did, Peter Jefferson. And then Jefferson got to know a lot of Native Americans throughout his life. So did John Adams. Probably the one who was the most steeped in Native American lore was Ben Franklin. He was, for 30 years, he was the U.S. envoy to various Native tribes, and used a lot of Native American iconography in his promotion of the Revolution in the early Republic.
By the way, just to digress, because you mentioned Ben Franklin, his brother totally hooked up with the British side, right? He was, when I say totally hooked up, he didn't support a revolution. Am I wrong about that? I thought I read that in your book also. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't recall Franklin.
That's wrong.
His grandson was, a great proponent of democracy, and was put in prison with John Adams because he published an article critical of Adams. But I
probably was having an adult beverage reading your, reading your book. And
it's a detail that I found someplace and I threw it in, and it just didn't stick in my brain.
No. I think you'd remember that. But more to the point, what I learned from those guys who you just talked about, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, is far be it from, they were not building a wall necessarily between themselves and Native American cultures or native cultures, native peoples. They were really using that as a platform on which to base a lot of the ideology and the stuff behind our Constitution and trying to build this society so it was workable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what's interesting is Americans think, the history we learn is so Eurocentric. The old joke that, American history is the history of dead white men. The story that we've told ourselves about democracy, American democracy, is that we got the ideas from dead white men. John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, not David Hume so much, but
Hobbes, maybe.
Thomas Hobbes, exactly. Diderot, and Rousseau. And in fact, those guys got their ideas of democracy. Those European Enlightenment philosophers got their ideas of democracy from a group of Native Americans, mostly Huron, French-speaking Native Americans, who traveled to Europe as guests of the French evangelists, the Catholic priests who had set up a community in the Huron, with the Huron nation, and engaged in vigorous debates about democracy with the intelligentsia of the time. And, Locke actually in one of his footnotes writes about, attending one of these salons. And so the Enlightenment philosophers actually got their idea from Native Americans. And then the American founders quoted the Enlightenment philosophers because that was much more politic than saying, last week I was down at Aniset's house and he had this to say to me. So we kind of laundered, the founders laundered their radical democracy ideas through the writings of British and French Enlightenment philosophers who were basically just reciting what the Native Americans had told them.
That's just great. That's the Eurocentricity again. Yeah. I through the book, in addition to this, and I love the fact that this book has a sort of call to action also, which we can get to, but I like the way you dispelled, frankly, a myth. And I think I had this myth, and this is what I was talking about when I was saying that I think I've accepted a lot of these myths. When talking about specific aspects of the Constitution, you talk about the Electoral College. Now, of course, we all, the demons of the Electoral College are visited upon us, it seems, in every election cycle for president. But I wonder if you could speak to the misconception and then set us straight on the actual thinking behind the Electoral College.
The Electoral College was a reasonably good idea when it was posited, and within 50 years it became an anachronism. It became unnecessary. The problem that the founders were looking at was, if you're going to have a national election for president in a country where electricity hasn't even been invented yet, Ben Franklin was still flying kites in thunderstorms. So you didn't even have the telegraph, much less radio or television. And, the Pony Express hadn't even been developed yet. I mean, it could take 2 weeks for a letter to travel from Georgia to Washington, D.C. So how would somebody in Georgia know whether this guy who's running for president, who's up there in D.C. or in New York State, is a scoundrel or a drunkard or, a terrible person who has, good PR or a newspaper publisher that he bought off in Georgia? And so what they did was they said, okay, instead of voting for the president, what the people in Georgia will do, and of course every state as well, is they'll vote for local electors, for wise elders, essentially. And this was kind of based on Jefferson's notion of the Wicke-Gemeinschaft, which was the council of wise elders that Paul de Ripon-de-Terrasse, the Whig histories, wrote about in the pre-Roman era British Isles, and also, kind of based on the Native American councils. And so these wise elders would then, get the sense of their people. Oh yeah, you all want us to vote for Andrew Jackson. Okay, cool. So now we'll go up to Washington, D.C. and we're going to interview this guy. And if he's a drunk or if he's a bad guy, and we'll talk to his friends and neighbors and we'll figure it out. And if he shouldn't be president, we'll vote for somebody else. And the Constitution explicitly gives the electors the power to do this, to become what we call faithless electors. And that's why. Hamilton wrote about this in the Federalist Papers. I think it's 52 or 53. It's somewhere in there. And, he said that this would be a way to weed out people of low character, low moral character. It certainly didn't work with Donald Trump, who lost the election by 3 million votes, but still won the Electoral College.
Or George Bush, for that matter.
Who lost by 500,000 votes.
Yeah. But the idea somehow that this is the myth, that the Electoral College is this, it was a power grab on the part of slave owners. That, I think, is something that was been out.
Mythology.
Yeah, right. It's wild to.
I mean, what it did was it did give people in the South, which was far more remote from the Northeast. The Northeast was fairly concentrated. It did give people in the South the ability to not blindly vote for somebody. But that's not, enhancing the power of Southern slave owners. That's just, making the elections work better, basically.
Well, you address a general misconception, which honestly is buttressed, I think, by so much of what we've seen and the general momentum, and sort of an oligarchical momentum. Oligarchical would be a ding word. The momentum associated with a power grab on the part of those who are the wealthiest. And what you craft here is this clean narrative of the way it really happened, which is not a power grab on the part of the wealthiest. In fact, you suggest that the wealthiest in the birthing of America actually were ready to give up a lot of, or some of what they had. It was the opposite of a power grab. It was really a way to allow more to participate. This is from the wealthy landowners of the time.
Right. You're talking about the entire Constitution now, not just the Electoral College, right?
Exactly. I'm sorry. I've gone to the Constitution now. Right.
No, that's good. Another one of the myths, and this one was kind of burned into American consciousness in 1929 when Charles and Mary Beard published their History of the United States, which, Charles was a socialist, Mary was a Marxist. They were professors at Columbia University, and they were looking at everything in American history basically through the lens of economics, of a Marxist critique of American economics. And so they just basically assumed without much evidence, and I have their book, the 2-volume set, and read it. I mean, I didn't read the whole thing, but I read the part about this. And just basically assumed without evidence that the Constitution was written by the richest people in America for the richest people in America to preserve their wealth. And Forrest McDonald did an in-depth analysis of this in 1956 in a book that he published. He's since passed away. And he went back and he looked at a couple of things. Number one, who were the people who signed the Declaration and signed the Constitution? Well, it turns out that they were not the richest people in the United States, or what we call the United States now, in the colonies. The richest people in the colonies, like the Johnson family up on Hudson River that had this castle with 300 European, retainers, they called them. They were dressed like the Swiss Guard, and wore, armor like the old knights, that was a rich family, and they fled to Canada when the American Revolution happened. Most of the genuinely rich people in the United States were deeply connected to the British monarchy and to the East India Company, and so they fled, or they took the side of the British. The richest man to sign the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock, and in today's dollars, his net worth at the time he signed the Constitution was about $700,000. He left no legacy. There's not a John Hancock Foundation named after him, like there is a Rockefeller Foundation, or there's no family wealth. Jefferson died in bankruptcy. Washington died in bankruptcy. Madison's family home was gone within a generation. I mean, these guys were basically the upper middle class, the ones whose names we know. And the ones whose names we don't know, a lot of the people who were involved in both the Declaration and the Constitution were like farmers and lawyers and teachers. And so, it wasn't the truly rich of America on behalf of the truly rich of America. And then B, when you look at in the individual constitutional ratifying conventions, what you find is that the truly rich generally opposed the Constitution. Patrick Henry in Virginia, for example, the richest man in Virginia, the largest slaveholder in the state, he had 360 enslaved people. I was going to say Americans, but I guess you couldn't quite call.
Not yet, right, American at that point.
Time. And America wasn't even a thing at that point in time. But Patrick Henry spoke up loudly against the Constitution because he was concerned that Article 1, Section 8 would give the president the power to call up the Virginia militia, which is, I write about this in my book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment, which is why James Madison changed the first draft of the Second Amendment from "for the security of a free nation" to "for the security of a free state," to assuage Henry's concern that the president could destroy the slave patrol of Virginia, which was the Virginia militia, by simply calling it up and moving it to another state. And that still didn't satisfy Patrick Henry. He was not a fan of the Constitution. So, and what McDonald found in looking at state after state after state was that in every single state, the majority of the people who voted for ratification of the Constitution were people who were in debt, people who were small subsistence level farmers, teachers, lawyers, which was not a high paid profession at the time, kind of the lowly professions and the average person. And the people who were opposed to it, by and large, were the wealthy mercantilists and merchants and the people who had amassed a lot of personal wealth.
And there is a sense that those, even, for example, George Washington, had an estate along with Jefferson, et cetera, and that he was among those who were the super wealthy. But as you point out, at his death, he wouldn't have even had the capital, I think you say in the book, to have bought his slaves and freed them. They were all freed, I suppose.
Yeah, when he died, it was his intention to free his slaves when he died, and he couldn't afford to do it.
Exactly. Thank you. But the other thing that I thought there was a purity to it, and then I do want to get to the call to action. I mean, I could just talk to you, all day about. I think there's great stuff in this book, but obviously you're a great mind on other stuff. But that there was an idealism on the part of these guys, that it was the opposite of a power grab. It was the opposite of. They were really trying to do something for the good of this place, this new place, America, and they saw it as something incredibly new. You have a line. They realized that the 7,000-year history of what they called civilization, only once before, he said, in the 7,000-year history, only once before in Athens, and only for a brief flicker of a few centuries, had anything like representative democracy ever been brought into existence and survived more than a generation or three. Their writings show that they truly believed they were doing sacred work, something greater than themselves. It's great because it flies in the face of so much which is the popular narrative.
Well, and the popular narrative is informed by wealthy white people, who would love a historical justification for their wealth and for the power that they're trying to grab.
I also think, Thom, this country set up by rich white guys, and it still protects rich white guys. It's helped by the second part still being, sadly, I think, kind of true, which is that wealthy white guys do well in this society. That doesn't mean that first part is true. And that's kind of what I think is interesting about your book and revealing about the book.
Yeah. Over time, the people, white people basically, have, well, not just over time, I mean, from the beginning, from 1619, white people have held power and position in this land, stolen land from Indians and enslaved people. And there's a long tail to that. This is a long legacy from that. But yeah,
so
real.
But I love the fact that those framers, and I've talked smack about the framers also because I'm so frustrated by where we've ended up, and we still talk about the framers with this deification that's gone on. But I think the reality is, after visiting with your book, and it's a quick read, it's really great. I don't mean to thump it too much, but I think it really is it's a good thing to grab a hold of and just get through. I think I have a new respect for them, to be perfectly honest. But now to the call to action and the things that have happened and how that Constitution has been perverted, et cetera. And I know we only have a couple minutes left, but my question is how to get the horse back in the barn that seems to have gotten out of the barn.
Right. The big problem that we have, that America has right now, outside of, I think the last time you and I talked, it was about my book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, how Reaganism gutted America. And that was a big problem. But that was facilitated by Lewis Powell's plan in 1971, the Powell Memo, to have basically the rich take over America. And then Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court in 72. And then in 76, he and a bunch of other conservatives on the court ruled that wealthy people's money being given to politicians was no longer to be considered bribery. It was considered free speech, that money was speech. And then 2 years later, in a decision that Lewis Powell himself actually authored, First National Bank versus Bellotti, the Supreme Court ruled that applied to corporations as well. And then, of course, in 2010, the Supreme Court tripled down on this with Citizens United. And so, that legalization of political bribery in 78 was what floated the Reagan administration into office in 1980 on a small tsunami of oil money, and has sustained the Republican Party and frankly some Democrats ever since. So the big challenge now is how do we unwind political bribery, because all of these other problems, the reason why billionaires, your average American billionaire right now pays 3.4% income tax is because the Supreme Court legalized their ability to purchase enough politicians to rewrite the tax code for them. The reason why we've got virtually every industry in America now controlled by fewer than 5 corporations and run as cartels, and they're price gouging us, producing inflation, is again because the Supreme Court legalized the bribery of politicians by those corporations and their CEOs and their stockholders. So the privately held ones. So this is the cancer that conservatives on the court embedded in the heart of America in the 70s. With the goal of basically taking this country back from what they viewed as socialism, which was the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. And, they've been doing battle against the New Deal ever since. Donald Trump just recently declared how if he becomes president, he's going to, basically seize all the power and destroy all these agencies that came out of the New Deal and came out of even Nixon, the EPA. And,
apropos of the EPA, I talk about the Supreme Court. It's an activist court without question. It's activist on the part of business, I think, in addition to the Roe v. Wade and the rollback and everything else that gets publicity. The idea somehow that you could completely undercut the government's ability to regulate, toxins in the water and toxins it's insanity, Thom. And yet, what you're talking about, the kind of reforms you're talking about, would require what then? A constitutional convention? Exactly. How do you see it, and what realistically could happen?
Well, Congress has the ability to overturn or overrule an awful lot of what the Supreme Court does. The For the People Act actually put restrictions back on money, in politics, some substantial ones. Now, it wasn't a complete repudiation of Citizens United. It was maybe a 20% repudiation, but it was significant. and provided for public financing for national presidential elections and all kinds of cool stuff. And it passed the House of Representatives, and it had 51 votes in the Senate. It would have passed the Senate, except the Republicans filibustered it, and then Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema refused to go along with breaking the filibuster. So, that has to be, I think, our first order of business, is revisiting the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in probably a new form. But even if it came up identical to the last time, I'd be happy with that. But that's going to have to wait until 2025 after the 2024 election, if we can keep the House, the Senate, and the White House.
Yeah, and even so, it's such a it's a razor thin margin, and it just seems as though, which is why the court is so powerful, Congress can't get a lot done anymore. Tom, it's very hard to imagine these kinds of watershed legislative moments that you're describing happening in this Congress.
Well, that's because, it is now legal for right-wing billionaires to own politicians, and they are doing it. The last election was a $4 billion election. I mean, the election before that was a $1 billion election. The next election is probably going to be the 2024. People say it might be a $10 billion election. I mean, we're looking at an exponential growth of not only the wealth of the top 1%, but the amount of money that they're throwing into politics. And they just view it as an investment. It's you invest
right.
$30-40 million in buying a couple of hundred politicians, and out of that you get $1 billion tax break.
And it's hard to get those politicians to vote against the gravy train, I think. But the hidden history of American democracy, rediscovering humanity's ancient way of living. You do touch on the Senate, and in our last minute or two, I feel the Senate is flawed, and it like really flawed. I'd open up the hood on the Senate. Give me some thoughts on that, please.
Sure. Well, because each state has only 2 senators, and we now have some very, very large states. California has 40 million people, and they have the same number of votes in the United States Senate as does Wyoming with 600,000 people. It's just not particularly small d Democratic. And right now, the Democrats, you got a 50-50 Senate, but the Democrats represent 41 million more people than do Republicans. That's not healthy. That's not good for a democracy. And so my humble proposal, was that we simply add 4 largely Democratic senators by enfranchising Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. If we really wanted to go crazy, and by the way, 3 Republican presidents did this. Lincoln, for example, needed 2 more Republican senators. And at that time, the threshold to add a senator for a territory to become a state was, as I recall, 39,000 citizens. And there were fewer than, as I recall, 7,000 citizens. It's in the book, the actual numbers. I'm pretty sure I've got them right, but don't fact check me. But Nevada at that time, the territory only had about 7,000 people in it. So Lincoln just said, screw it. We're going to make them a state anyway. I need 2 Republican senators. And then Benjamin Harrison did the same thing with the Dakota Territory, which barely had enough people for one to be one
Crazy.
state. And he made it into 2 states to get 4 Republican senators. So this has been done before.
Yeah, I mean, the Puerto Rico, if you believe in one person, one vote, I just don't understand. These people deserve representation. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so, I guess if you grow up with nothing, you're kind of used to nothing. You kind of rationalize it, but it really is wrong. But as you suggest, it's pure politics that Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. don't have representation. Look, love your stuff. I'm a big fan, and I want you to write more, because apparently that's the only way we're going to have conversations on this show, is every time you do a book. So I want you to come back and visit. The new one is The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. The great Thom Hartmann. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Enjoy it. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.